All right, guys, today we are going to have a bit of a smorgasbord. And as I was preparing what I was going to say today, and I said that word in my head, I figured you might not know what that word means because I feel like it's an old farty word that only I would use in the classroom. So I looked up the definition, which I actually didn't know myself. I only knew the expression. So today's a smorgasbord. It basically means it's like a buffet. It's kind of a bunch of random items that loosely tie into the theme of culture in the 1950s. So join me for the ride, shall we? So the first thing, if you look through the assignments already, that you guys are going to do today is you're going to do some quick research on 1950s songs. And I threw, you can see the 60s up here, which is totally a different genre of music. But since we're not going to be together in the classroom for me to actually play Name That Tune with you, which I normally would, I just implore you guys to explore those two decades because the music is just really great in terms of just saying a lot about the time period. So we did talk about music in a previous chapter and how it started to become important in the 20s and so on. And I played We're Not Gonna Take It. No, we ain't gonna take it, which actually ties into this whole cultural thing, which is why we listened to it to begin with. So I digress. Anyway, your first assignment is just to do a little Google search about music during the time period and to post it into the class comments. I think that's what it says on your screen. And named simply the title of the song. I'm hoping if you just look through a couple of the songs, and YouTube has some great montages where it will play through 20 of them for you in a row. I'm hoping maybe you'll be surprised that you actually recognize some of them. You might not know any of them, so it'll be a learning curve for all of you. Moving on, start with the boring first. Throughout the 1950s, we did have some political stuff going on, which of course we know at this point in the year, culture affects history, history affects our culture. So starting off with the politics. After World War II, we had a lesson learned from World War I, and that was to help the veterans when they came home. So after World War II, we offered a GI Bill of Rights to help the veterans that came home and help them kind of establish themselves a little bit easier than last time. Similar to World War I, there were some political issues as far as employment that went on. Unions started to rise again, similar to World War I. So there was a little bit of labor unrest, and this was giving Truman a bit of a bad rap because people didn't think he was handling it correctly. On top of that comes the election, 1948. So during this election year, Truman was running against Dewey, and he was offering not a square deal, but a fair deal this time around. These are some of the big hot button political issues that were in place that they were pushing for with the fair deal. And there's actually, I'm only even mentioning it because there's a funny little story that goes along. So look at the picture, guys. Look very closely. Now, what did I just say? Who won the election? Truman actually wins the election very carefully. So this is Truman, and this is a cute little moment in history where you can see he's holding up the front page of a newspaper that says the opposite. So no, the newspaper didn't mess up. They actually, since the race was so close, and of course, the newspapers wanted to be the first ones to get the information out to the public, they had two different copies of the newspaper printed the night before. One where the front page says how Dewey won, and one where the front page says that Truman won. So it's a funny little moment in history. So on to some slightly more interesting things, depending on your vibe, and if you enjoy history, which I hope some of you do at this point. So the 1950s, you have the infamous group known as the baby boomers. This is their time period, my friends. They're all coming about. So the baby boomers is, just to give you an age reference, my mother is considered a baby boomer. She was born in 1949, so she falls into this generation gap. You also have something interesting coming about known as the Sun Belt. It's kind of similar to what we would call snowbirds. So people basically moving around the country, hitting the age of retirement, moving somewhere warmer. And this was just like an interesting cultural thing. Before this time period, we wouldn't have had the financial means to do that, the ability to transport ourselves that easily. And so it's just a fun new little detail coming up to the retiring age people, and well, regular age people too, I guess. Might not be exciting, but obviously super important as far as connecting the country. You have the 1956 Highway Act, so actual highways going across state lines and all that stuff is being established. And then this is kind of repetitious because we mentioned suburbia before. And we talked about the suburbs at first as simply being the area that grew right outside the cities, right? That's what the suburban areas that's where the name came from. You know, people who spilled over from the cities and the urban regions. But now we are actually starting to establish in the 50s the suburbs that we know and love today. And I say we know and love it because we all be living in them. So take a look around, look out your window. You guys are in the suburbs right now, or at least what the 1950s established as the suburbs. Here's some other interesting things which we've all grown up with, but it actually didn't really kind of exist before the time period. So by the 50s, appliances are all the rage, like how nowadays people are like, oh, do you have stainless steel? Do you have, you know, a 5-burner stove? So, this is basically where appliances are becoming a cool thing, I guess, for lack of a better expression. Yard keeping, making sure your lawns are nice and neat became the trend, judging all your neighbors and the appearance of their households, kids' sports and all that fun competition. This is all becoming a thing. And I throw this last word up here. This is where conformity and consumerism started to become monstrous, right? Wanting what your neighbors have, kind of, I make it sound so horrible, but like judging your neighbors and trying to conform and all that kind of stuff. So love it or hate it, it's coming about in the 50s. So just like the little song I was singing before, we're not going to take it, blah, blah, blah. My kids are all making fun of me right now, so I won't re-sing it for you. But anyway, we have rebels during this time period. So not that urban life is being a rebel, but anyway, they want to fix up the urban regions, keep them nice and neat. Women kind of had a rebellious streak because remember, during the war, they were all out working in every job that there was in the country, and now they're kind of pushed back into the kitchen. So a lot of you guys might grow up knowing that the 50s is this like wholesome, like those really cute mom and pop TV show kind of generation. And so this is where this image is kind of coming back. Women were pushed out of the workplace and pushed into like the more traditional raising the kids, staying at home kind of thing. And the women who didn't do that were considered the rebels. The true rebels of the time period, this is what they looked like. I don't know what our rebels would be like. Rebels were like, you know, the goth kids or punk or, you know, the kids with the mohawks, maybe the piercings. I don't know, whatever our generation would include as their rebels. For the 1950s, the rebels were called the beatniks. And so this is what they looked like. Very dark, black, eyeliner, that kind of thing. And to go along with the rebels, you guys are probably going to read something from this genre in high school. You have the two rebel writers, Salinger and T.C. Eliot, who were like the critics of the time period and, you know, going against the man. So here's a quick montage of some of the exciting things from the 1950s. I'm sure you'll recognize all of them. Television obviously changes the entire country and world. You know, we've already kind of talked about the car thing, but that's definitely a legit thing now with the gas stations and the diners and the drive-in movies and all that kind of stuff. You see the hairdos, famous actresses. We talked about the Pan Am flights beginning back in the what was that, the end of the 1920s, but now that commercial flight is like a legit deal. There's your war on appliances as well. Games of the 1950s. This is, I just thought was hilarious because we've been doing a lot of all this, at least in my household. Sorry has been a huge bone of contention with many tears and game pieces being thrown across the room. Here's a big flash on some other fun things that you might know that came about in the 1950s. I know we've talked about the different dancing from the time periods earlier. So the 1950s, aside from Elvis, and I wish I were in front of you right now because I would demonstrate his moving hips. If you don't know what that looks like, please feel free to Google it. He was a bit scandalous in how he moved his pelvis, my friends. But wholesome dancing for the groups, for the high school dances and the dance clubs was becoming more of the trend. So you're talking innocent things like the bunny hop. Again, Google it if you don't know it. I wish it were in front of you so I can demonstrate it. I know how much you guys all love that. There's also something called the stroll, which was when people would line up in like 2 rows and then a couple would go and do a little dance in between the rows. Again, Google it. It's all out there for you to make fun of later. All right, the last thing before I throw out your last assignment, I just thought this was too fascinating not to at least mention it to you guys, even though we can't actually work on it together in class. And you probably don't have access to this stuff. I do, you know, because I got the little ones. If you don't, just take in the information and be fascinated. If you do happen to have any of these familiar looking books at home, please just read it over real quick and you might be fascinated. So we've mentioned before, Dr. Seuss first started his career with political cartoons. So his heart was really always kind of in politics and that kind of stuff. He later goes into children writing. So if you haven't picked up on this with some of these famous childhood books, I'm sure you've read at least one of them, they are embedded with a lot of political ideals, some more obvious than the other, like the Lorax. If you know that story or if you've seen the movie, it's all about hurting the environment and greed and industrialization. So if you look at this little image here, it changes all the names to what the book, Dr. Seuss was really writing about. So it's really kind of cool. This was one of my childhood favorites, and I never thought about this before, but it's crazy because it's so true. This book I had never read before about, what is it, Yertle the Turtle or something? So if you've never read this one, I read it after, reading up on Dr. Seuss a little bit. This was so cool on how the entire book really does line up with the Hitler's philosophies. And obviously Dr. Seuss is criticizing all of this kind of stuff, but check it out. It was mind-blowing. I'm serious. All right, last thing for you guys today. Your actual assignment today is just a little fun one. It's kind of a Mad Libs fill in the blank thing. So I left you guys a timeline of important inventions and people of the 1950s. Your job today is to try to fill in the blanks. Some will be obvious, and yay, fill them in. Some you might be able to Google and find the correct answers. I'm not really stressed about you getting them all correct by any means. I just kind of want you to have fun with it and see what you know. Take some guesses. You don't necessarily have to research everything. You can feel free to use it like a Mad Libs and just take a guess and fill in the blank. I will provide you guys with the answers tomorrow because I think some of them will probably bug you if you're not certain what the answers are. Also, feel free to use this as like a family activity. Ask siblings, parents, whomever you're Zooming with today, and see if they know any of the answers to help you out. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the 50s. If you get the chance to YouTube not only the songs, but maybe one of the old TV shows like Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy, it'll tell you so much about the culture of the time period. So with that in mind, guys, that's it for today. I think it's Wednesday. I'm not really sure. I'm losing track of the days of the week. Adios.